Picture this: a 7-year-old boy being torn from his mother's arms, never to return home again. This isn't a tragedy. It's Tuesday in ancient Sparta. While other Greek children played with toys, Spartan kids learned to kill. While other cities built beautiful temples, Sparta built the most feared military machine the ancient world had ever seen. For over 300 years, these warriors dominated Greece, not through numbers, but through sheer, terrifying discipline. They created a society so extreme that even today, we use their name to describe the ultimate in harsh, no-nonsense living. But Sparta wasn't born overnight, as this military juggernaut. This is the complete story of how a small group of invaders in southern Greece transformed themselves into legends, and how their obsession with perfection ultimately led to their downfall, from Bronze Age collapse to their last stand against Rome. This is the entire story of the Spartans. Long before the first Spartan warrior ever raised a bronze-tipped spear, the fertile valleys of southern Greece told a very different story. The Peloponnese, that hand-shaped peninsula that dangles from mainland Greece like a ripe fruit ready to fall, was home to one of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations. The Bronze Age Peloponnese wasn't the harsh militaristic landscape we associate with Sparta. Instead, it flourished under the Mycenaeans, those palace-building, Linear B-writing ancestors of classical Greece, who ruled from roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE. Their world was one of elaborate ceremonies, extensive trade networks, and monumental architecture that still takes your breath away today. In the heart of what would become Spartan territory, the Mycenaeans built the city of Amyclae. This wasn't some primitive hill fort. Amyclae was a proper Bronze Age metropolis, complete with a massive palace complex, sophisticated drainage systems, and workshops that produced everything from bronze weapons to delicate ivory carvings. Archaeological evidence shows that Amyclae controlled much of the Eurotas River Valley, that crucial waterway that would later become the lifeline of Spartan power. The Mycenaean world was interconnected in ways that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. Merchants from Amyclae traded with Egypt, bringing back gold, ivory, and exotic goods that decorated their palaces. They imported tin from as far away as Britain to mix with local copper, creating the bronze that gave this age its name. Their scribes kept meticulous records in Linear B, documenting everything from tax receipts to religious ceremonies. But this Bronze Age paradise had a fatal flaw: it was incredibly fragile. The entire Mycenaean system depended on complex administrative networks centered around palace complexes. Remove the palace, and the whole system collapsed like a house of cards. And around 1200 BCE, that's exactly what happened. The collapse of Bronze Age civilization wasn't a single dramatic event. It was more like watching a slow-motion avalanche. Archaeological evidence shows widespread destruction across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities were abandoned, trade networks collapsed, and the art of writing itself was forgotten in many regions. Historians still debate the exact causes, but the results were undeniable. The sophisticated world of the Mycenaeans simply vanished. Some scholars blame invasions by mysterious sea peoples who swept across the Mediterranean like a Bronze Age hurricane. Others point to internal rebellions, climate change, or economic collapse. The truth was probably a combination of all these factors, creating a perfect storm that brought down civilization itself. In the Eurotas Valley, the great palace of Amyclae was abandoned sometime around 1100 BCE. The sophisticated drainage systems clogged with debris. The workshops fell silent. The scribes, who had recorded the daily business of a thriving city, put down their styluses for the last time. Within a generation, the art of reading and writing had vanished from the Greek world. This wasn't just a political change. It was a civilizational reset. The population of Greece dropped dramatically. The survivors scattered into small, isolated communities that struggled just to maintain the basics of agriculture and defense. International trade, which had connected Greece to the wider Mediterranean world, ground to a halt. Bronze, that wonder metal of the ancient world, became so rare that people started hoarding broken tools and weapons, hoping to reforge them into something useful. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of profound loss, where Mycenaean sites show evidence of elaborate feasts with hundreds of participants. Dark Age settlements struggled to feed a few dozen people. Where Bronze Age craftsmen had created intricate jewelry and decorated weapons, their successors made simple, functional pottery that prioritized utility over beauty. But human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures. Slowly, painfully, the survivors began to rebuild. In the Eurotas Valley, small communities of farmers and herders established themselves among the ruins of Mycenaean greatness. They weren't trying to recreate the past, they were simply trying to survive. These early Dark Age settlements were nothing like the palace complexes that had come before. Instead of massive stone buildings, people lived in simple huts made of mud brick and thatch. Instead of specialized craftsmen producing luxury goods, every family had to be self-sufficient, making their own tools, weapons, and pottery. Instead of elaborate religious ceremonies in grand temples, worship took place at simple outdoor altars. The population was tiny compared to Bronze Age levels. Where Mycenaean Clay might have housed thousands of people, the Dark Age settlements in the Eurotas Valley probably contained only a few hundred souls scattered across multiple small villages. These communities were isolated not just from the wider world, but often from each other. A journey that would take a few hours today could be a dangerous multi-day expedition in the Dark Age Peloponnese. Yet even in these humble beginnings we can see the seeds of what would become Spartan culture. Dark Age communities in the Eurotas Valley were constantly threatened by raiders, wild animals, and the simple struggle to grow enough food to survive. This meant that every able-bodied man had to be ready to fight at a moment's notice. Unlike the specialized military classes of the Bronze Age, Dark Age warriors were farmer soldiers who grabbed their spears when danger threatened and returned to their fields when the crisis passed. The archaeological evidence shows that these early communities were remarkably egalitarian compared to what came before. Bronze Age society had been rigidly hierarchical, with palace elites controlling vast resources while ordinary people lived in relative poverty. But Dark Age settlements show much less inequality. Everyone lived in similar simple houses, ate similar simple food, and used similar simple tools. This wasn't because these people were naturally democratic. It was because they were too poor and too few to support elaborate social hierarchies. When your entire community consists of a few dozen families struggling to survive, you can't afford to have half of them doing nothing but administration and ceremony. Everyone had to contribute, and everyone had to be ready to fight. The oral traditions that would later shape Greek culture began to take form during these dark centuries. Without writing, communities had to preserve their history, laws, and religious beliefs through spoken word. Professional bards wandered from settlement to settlement, carrying news and entertaining audiences with stories of heroic deeds and divine interventions. These weren't just entertainment, they were the cultural DNA of Dark Age Greece. Through epic poems and heroic tales, communities maintained connections to their Bronze Age past, while adapting those memories to their present reality. The warriors of these stories weren't palace-dwelling bureaucrats, but tough, self-reliant fighters who earned their status through personal courage and military skill. Religion, too, adapted to the new reality. Instead of the elaborate state ceremonies of the Bronze Age, Dark Age Greeks developed a more personal, immediate relationship with their gods. Local deities associated with specific places, springs, groves, hilltops, became increasingly important. These weren't distant cosmic forces, but neighbors who could be bargained with, pleased with simple offerings, and called upon in times of crisis. The Eurotas Valley communities developed their own local variants of these broader Greek cultural patterns. They honored Hyacinthus, a local deity associated with the changing seasons and the agricultural cycle that was so crucial to their survival. They told stories of heroes who had defended the valley against invasion and disaster. They developed customs and traditions that would eventually influence the rigid social structure of classical Sparta. As the centuries passed, these small settlements gradually grew larger and more sophisticated. Agricultural techniques improved, allowing communities to support slightly larger populations. Trade began to revive on a small scale, with communities exchanging surplus goods for materials they couldn't produce locally. The quality of pottery and metalwork slowly increased, as specialized craftsmen emerged within the larger settlements. By around 900 BCE, the Eurotas Valley contained several significant settlements, each controlling its own territory and maintaining its own traditions. These weren't yet cities in the classical sense. They were more like large villages surrounded by farmland and pasture, but they represented a crucial step in the recovery from Bronze Age collapse. The largest of these settlements was developing near the site of ancient Clay, taking advantage of the same geographical features that had made the Bronze Age city successful. The Eurotas River provided fresh water and fertile soil for agriculture. The surrounding hills offered defensive positions and grazing land for livestock. The location provided easy access to both the mountainous interior of the Peloponnese and the coastal regions that were slowly reconnecting with the wider Mediterranean world. But this gradual recovery was about to be disrupted by a new wave of migration that would transform the Eurotas Valley forever. From the north, new groups of Greek speakers were moving into the Peloponnese, bringing with them different customs, different technologies, and different ideas about how society should be organized. These newcomers called themselves Dorians, and they were about to change everything. The stage was set for the birth of Sparta, though no one could have predicted the extraordinary society that would emerge from the collision between the valley's existing communities and these northern invaders. The Dorian migration wasn't a single dramatic conquest, but rather a gradual process of infiltration, intermarriage, and cultural mixing that played out over several generations. Some communities welcomed the newcomers, seeing them as potential allies against raiders and rival settlements. Others resisted, leading to conflicts that would echo through Spartan history for centuries to come. What made the Dorians different wasn't just their northern origins, it was their approach to social organization. While the existing valley communities had developed relatively egalitarian structures out of necessity, the Dorians brought with them more rigid hierarchical concepts that had survived from the Bronze Age collapse in different forms. The collision between these two cultural traditions, the pragmatic egalitarianism of the Dark Age survivors and the hierarchical instincts of the Dorian migrants, would create something entirely new. The crucible of the Eurotas Valley. These competing traditions would fuse into the unique social system that would define Sparta for the next 7 centuries. The pre-Spartan Peloponnese was thus a world in transition, balanced precariously between the fading memories of Bronze Age grandeur and the uncertain promise of a new kind of civilization. The communities of the Eurotas Valley had survived the collapse of the ancient world and were slowly building something new. They had no way of knowing that their small settlements would become the foundation for one of history's most extraordinary military societies. As the Dark Age drew to a close and new peoples moved into the valley, the stage was set for the next chapter in this remarkable story. The Dorians were coming, and with them would come the ideas, institutions, and conflicts that would forge the Spartan way of life. The Dorian arrival in the Eurotas Valley wasn't announced by trumpets or marked by grand battles. It was more like watching water slowly seep into dry ground. Around 1100 BCE, these Greek-speaking peoples from the north began filtering into the Peloponnese, not as a unified army but as small groups of families, clans and tribes, seeking new homes in a world still recovering from Bronze Age collapse. What made the Dorians different wasn't their technology or their numbers, it was their mindset. While the existing valley communities had spent centuries adapting to scarcity and developing cooperative survival strategies, the Dorians brought with them a more aggressive, hierarchical worldview that had been preserved in the mountainous regions of northern Greece. The Dorians didn't see themselves as refugees or migrants, they saw themselves as conquerors with a divine right to the lands they occupied. Their oral traditions spoke of Heracles, the great hero whose descendants had been cheated out of their rightful inheritance in the Peloponnese. They weren't invading foreign territory, they were reclaiming what the gods had promised them. This ideological framework would prove crucial in shaping what became Spartan society. Unlike other Greek communities that gradually assimilated newcomers through intermarriage and cultural mixing, the Dorians in the Eurotas Valley maintained sharp distinctions between themselves and the people they conquered. This wasn't just ethnic prejudice. It was a conscious political strategy designed to maintain control over a potentially hostile population. The conquest itself unfolded over several generations. Archaeological evidence suggests that some existing settlements were destroyed during this period, while others show signs of gradual cultural change as Dorian influence grew. The process was messy, violent, and uneven, with different communities experiencing different fates depending on their location, their willingness to resist, and their strategic value to the newcomers. The Dorians were particularly interested in controlling the most fertile agricultural land and the strategic high points that commanded views of the valley. They established fortified settlements on hilltops, from which they could monitor and control the movements of the existing population. These weren't just military outposts, They were the nuclei of a new kind of social organization that would eventually evolve into the classical Spartan state. One of the most significant Dorian innovations was their approach to land ownership. Instead of the relatively egalitarian land-sharing practices that had developed during the Dark Age, the Dorians implemented a system based on conquest and inheritance. The best land went to the warrior families who had participated in the conquest, while the existing population was relegated to less desirable territory or forced to work land they no longer owned. This created an immediate problem. How do you maintain control over a population that outnumbers you and has good reason to resent your presence? The Dorian solution was elegantly brutal. They created a social system based on permanent military readiness and systematic intimidation. The conquered populations were divided into different categories based on their perceived threat level and economic value. The most potentially dangerous groups, particularly the populations of Messenia, that fertile region to the west of the Eurotas Valley, were reduced to helotage, a form of state slavery that was more systematic and oppressive than anything else in the Greek world. Helots weren't property in the way that chattel slaves were in other societies. They couldn't be bought or sold individually, and they maintained some connection to their ancestral lands, but they had no political rights, no freedom of movement, and were subject to annual declarations of war by the Spartan state that made killing them legally permissible. The Helot system was designed to solve several problems simultaneously. It provided the agricultural labor force necessary to support a warrior class that spent most of its time training for war instead of working the land. It generated the economic surplus needed to support sophisticated military equipment and training programs, and it created a permanent enemy within Spartan territory, ensuring that the warrior class could never afford to let their guard down or abandon their military readiness. Between the Dorian conquerors and the Helot slaves, the new social system included an intermediate group called the perioikoi, literally those who live around. These were free communities that maintained local autonomy in exchange for providing military service and manufactured goods to the Spartan state. Some perioikoi were descendants of the original valley communities that had negotiated favorable terms during the conquest. Others were Dorian groups that had arrived too late to claim full membership in the conquering elite. The perioikoi occupied a crucial middle position in the emerging Spartan system. They weren't full citizens with political rights, but they weren't slaves either. They could own property, engage in trade, and practice crafts that were forbidden to full Spartans. This intermediate status made them natural allies of the Spartan state, since their privileged position depended on maintaining the system that kept the Helots subordinate. At the top of this social pyramid sat the Spartiates, the full citizens who claimed descent from the original Dorian conquerors. This was a deliberately exclusive group, probably never numbering more than a few thousand adult males, even at the height of Spartan power. Membership was hereditary and jealously guarded, with strict rules governing marriage, property ownership, and behavior. The creation of this three-tier social system wasn't the result of careful planning. It emerged organically from the practical problems of conquest and control, but once established, it created powerful incentives for the development of the extreme military culture that would make Sparta famous throughout the ancient world. The Spartiates couldn't afford to be part-time soldiers, like the warrior farmers of other Greek cities. With a potentially rebellious Helot population outnumbering them by perhaps 10 to 1, they needed to maintain constant military readiness. This meant developing professional military skills, sophisticated training programs, and social institutions designed to produce the most effective warriors possible. Enter Lycurgus, the semi-legendary figure who supposedly gave Sparta its distinctive laws and customs. Whether Lycurgus was a real historical person or a mythical representation of collective social development remains hotly debated by historians. What's clear is that sometime during the 8th or 7th century BCE, Spartan society underwent a dramatic transformation that created the classical military system. The Great Rhetora, Sparta's fundamental constitutional document, established the basic framework of Spartan government and society. Unlike the written constitutions of other Greek cities, the Great Rhetora was an oral tradition that could be modified and reinterpreted by each generation while maintaining the appearance of ancient unchanging law. The Great Rhetora created a unique system of dual kingship, with two royal families sharing power and serving as checks on each other's ambitions. This wasn't just political innovation, It was a practical solution to the problem of leadership succession in a society where military effectiveness was literally a matter of life and death. With two kings, the state could survive the death or incompetence of either one without losing its military leadership. Below the kings, the great Retro established a council of elders, the Gerousia, composed of men over 60 who had proven their worth through decades of military service. This body served as both a supreme court and a legislative council, providing institutional memory and wisdom to balance the potentially rash decisions of younger warriors. The citizen assembly, the ecclesia, included all adult male Spartiates, but its role was limited to approving or rejecting proposals made by the kings and Gerousia. This wasn't democracy in the Athenian sense, but it did ensure that major decisions had the support of the warrior class that would have to implement them on the battlefield. The great Retra also established the fundamental principle that would define Spartan society: the complete subordination of individual interests to collective military effectiveness. Personal wealth accumulation was discouraged through sumptuary laws that prohibited luxury and ostentation. Private property in the traditional sense was limited, with the state controlling land distribution and inheritance. Most importantly, the great Retra established the principle that Spartan children belonged to the state rather than to their families. This wasn't just symbolic. It was a practical recognition that producing effective warriors required systematic training from childhood, not the haphazard education that most Greek cities provided. The transformation of Spartan society wasn't accomplished overnight. Archaeological evidence suggests that the classical system developed gradually over several centuries, with different elements being added and refined as circumstances changed. The process was probably driven as much by practical necessity as by ideological commitment to military excellence. The constant threat of Helot rebellion meant that Spartans couldn't afford the luxury of internal political conflict that characterized other Greek cities. The system had to produce not just individual warriors, but cohesive military units capable of operating effectively under extreme stress. This required unprecedented levels of social coordination and individual discipline. The economic foundation of this system was the Helot labor force that freed Spartans from the need to engage in agricultural work or craft production. Each Spartan citizen was assigned a plot of land worked by Helots, providing the economic surplus necessary to support full-time military training. This wasn't just about leisure time, it was about creating the material conditions necessary for professional military excellence. The Helot system also created a permanent training environment for Spartan warriors. The annual Crypteia, a secretive program in which young Spartans hunted and killed Helots, wasn't just terrorism, though it certainly served that function. It was also a form of advanced military training that taught young warriors to operate independently behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, and kill efficiently under pressure. This systematic brutality toward the Helots wasn't incidental to Spartan military culture, it was central to it. By normalizing violence against a dehumanized enemy population, the system prepared Spartans psychologically for the extreme violence of ancient warfare. You can't create soldiers capable of standing firm in a phalanx battle against professional enemies if they've been raised to view violence as morally problematic. The religious dimension of Spartan society reinforced these military values. The state cult centered around gods of war, victory and death, with elaborate festivals celebrating military virtues and honoring fallen warriors. Religious ceremonies weren't separate from military training. They were integrated into a comprehensive system designed to produce warriors who viewed death in battle as the highest form of religious devotion. The transformation of the Eurotas Valley from a collection of Dark Age farming communities into this extraordinary military society represents one of the most dramatic social engineering projects in human history. Within a few centuries, the descendants of Bronze Age collapse survivors had created a state that would dominate Greek military affairs for 300 years. But this transformation came at an enormous cost. The creation of classical Sparta required the systematic enslavement of entire populations, the suppression of individual creativity and initiative, and the subordination of all human values to military effectiveness. The society that emerged was certainly efficient at producing warriors, but it was also brittle, inflexible, and ultimately unsustainable. The birth of Spartan warrior culture wasn't a gradual evolution from existing Greek traditions. It was a revolutionary break with the past that created something entirely new in human experience. The Dorian conquest had provided the initial framework, but the classical Spartan system was a conscious creation designed to solve specific problems of control and defense in a hostile environment. As this new society took shape, its most distinctive feature began to emerge: the Agoge, the comprehensive education system that would transform Spartan children into the most feared warriors in the ancient world. The stage was set for the next phase of Spartan development, in which the theories and institutions created by the great Rhetor would be put into practice through the systematic training of a new generation of warriors. 7 years old. That's when childhood ended in Sparta. While other Greek children were learning to read and write, playing with toys and enjoying their mother's affection, Spartan boys were ripped from their families and thrust into the most rigorous military training program the ancient world had ever devised. This wasn't education as we understand it. This was the systematic forging of human weapons. The word Agoge itself means leading or guidance, but these gentle terms masked a reality that was harsh beyond modern comprehension. The Agoge wasn't just about learning to fight. It was about rewiring the human psyche to prioritize collective survival over individual comfort, to view pain as weakness leaving the body, and to consider death in battle as the highest possible achievement. The process began before birth. Spartan women weren't just expected to produce children, they were expected to produce warriors. Pregnancy was treated as a form of military service, with expectant mothers following exercise regimens designed to produce strong, healthy babies. The state had a direct interest in the physical quality of each generation, and prenatal care reflected this priority. When a child was born, they didn't automatically become citizens. Instead, they were examined by a council of elders who determined their fitness for membership in Spartan society. Weak, deformed, or sickly infants were abandoned on the slopes of Mount Taygetus to die of exposure. This wasn't considered cruel. It was considered necessary quality control for a society that couldn't afford to waste resources on individuals who would never contribute to collective defense. Modern sensibilities recoil from this practice, but it's important to understand the logic behind it. Sparta existed in a constant state of siege, surrounded by enemies and sitting on top of a potentially rebellious slave population that outnumbered them 10-1. Every resource spent on supporting a non-warrior was a resource that couldn't be spent on military preparation. The society couldn't afford sentiment when survival was at stake. Those infants who passed inspection returned home with their families, but this reprieve was temporary. Spartan mothers were allowed to love their children, but they were never allowed to forget that those children belonged to the state. From the earliest age, Spartan children were taught that their highest loyalty was not to family, but to the collective good of their warrior society. The training that would shape these children began informally from the moment they could walk. Spartan homes didn't coddle children the way other Greek families did. There were no soft beds, rich foods, or protective clothing. Children slept on hard surfaces, ate simple food, and wore minimal clothing even in winter. This wasn't poverty, it was conditioning. Physical fitness was emphasized from the earliest age. While other Greek children played games for fun, Spartan children engaged in activities designed to build strength, speed, and pain tolerance. Wrestling, running, and swimming weren't recreation. They were preparation for a lifetime of military service. But the real transformation began at age 7, when boys were taken from their families and enrolled in the Agoge proper. This wasn't a school in any conventional sense. It was a comprehensive life restructuring program designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it according to Spartan military values. The boys were organized into groups called herds, a deliberately animalistic term that reflected their status as raw material to be shaped by their instructors. These groups became their new families, providing the emotional bonds and social identity that had previously come from blood relatives. The message was clear: your loyalty belongs to your military unit, not to the people who happen to give birth to you. The physical conditions of the Agoge were deliberately harsh. Boys slept in dormitories on beds made of reeds they had to gather themselves from the Euphrates River. They wore a single cloak year-round. Regardless of weather conditions, they went barefoot to toughen their feet and develop better balance and agility. Food was kept deliberately scarce, not because the state couldn't afford to feed them properly, but because hunger was considered an essential part of training. Hungry boys had to be resourceful, creative, and aggressive to survive. They were expected to steal food, and the only punishment was for getting caught. which demonstrated insufficient stealth skills rather than moral failure. This systematic undernourishment served multiple purposes. It made the boys physically tough and mentally resilient. It taught them to function effectively under extreme stress. It prepared them for the reality of military campaigns, where food would often be scarce and soldiers would need to forage, raid, or go hungry. Most importantly, it reinforced the lesson that individual comfort was less important than collective strength. The educational curriculum of the Agoge was unlike anything else in the Greek world. While other cities emphasized literature, rhetoric, and philosophy, Spartan education focused on practical military skills and physical conditioning. Boys learned to read and write, but only enough to understand military orders and basic communications. Intellectual curiosity was actively discouraged as a distraction from more important pursuits. Music and dance were part of the curriculum, but these weren't arts for their own sake. They were military training tools. Spartan songs were martial compositions designed to inspire courage and solidarity. Spartan dances were weapons drills performed to rhythm. Every cultural activity was subordinated to the primary goal of producing effective warriors. The boys were taught to speak laconically, using as few words as possible to communicate essential information. This wasn't just a cultural quirk, it was a practical military skill on the battlefield. Clear, concise communication could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The famous Spartan wit that impressed other Greeks wasn't about cleverness for its own sake. It was about precision under pressure. Physical training intensified with age. Younger boys focused on basic conditioning, running, swimming, climbing, and wrestling. As they grew older, the training became more sophisticated and dangerous. They learned to use weapons, practiced formation fighting, and engaged in combat exercises that regularly resulted in serious injuries. Pain tolerance was a crucial component of training. Boys who showed fear, complained about hardship, or sought comfort were subjected to additional punishment and public humiliation. The goal wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the systematic elimination of weakness that could compromise unit effectiveness in battle. The psychological dimension of Agoge training was just as important as the physical conditioning. Boys were taught to view themselves as part of a sacred brotherhood whose mission was to protect Spartan civilization from its enemies. Individual identity was subsumed into collective purpose, creating warriors who would literally rather die than let down their comrades. This process was reinforced through elaborate initiation rituals and tests of courage. The most famous was the ordeal at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where boys were flogged until they lost consciousness or died. Those who cried out or begged for mercy were disgraced, while those who endured in silence earned honor and respect. These rituals weren't sadistic entertainment. They were practical tests of the psychological conditioning that the Agoge was designed to produce. A warrior who couldn't endure physical pain without breaking wasn't ready for the reality of ancient combat, where wounds were common and medical treatment was primitive. The social dynamics within the Agoge reinforced these military values. Older boys were given authority over younger ones, creating a hierarchy based on military virtues rather than birth or wealth. Competition was constant and fierce, but it was always framed in terms of collective benefit rather than individual achievement. Boys who excelled in training earned recognition and privileges, but they were also expected to help their weaker comrades improve. The goal wasn't to produce individual champions, but to create cohesive units where every member met minimum standards of effectiveness. A boy who achieved personal excellence while allowing his comrades to fail was considered a failure himself. The mentorship system within the Agoge reflected broader Spartan social values. Older warriors took personal interest in promising young boys, providing guidance, protection, and emotional support that replaced the family relationships that had been severed at age 7. These relationships were often intensely emotional and sometimes sexual, but they were always framed in terms of military development rather than personal pleasure. The treatment of girls in Spartan society was unique among Greek cities, reflecting the same practical military logic that shaped the Agoge for boys. While other Greek women lived in seclusion and were considered inferior to men, Spartan women received physical training, education, and social freedoms that scandalized the rest of the Greek world. This wasn't because Spartans believed in gender equality as a moral principle. It was because they understood that producing superior warriors required superior mothers. Weak, sheltered women couldn't be expected to give birth to strong children, or to raise them with the toughness that Spartan society demanded. Spartan girls engaged in athletic competitions learnt to read and write and were encouraged to develop physical strength and mental toughness. They competed in foot races, wrestling matches, and javelin throwing, often in the nude, shocking visitors from other Greek cities who were accustomed to seeing women completely covered and confined to domestic spaces. The marriage customs of Sparta reflected these same practical considerations. Marriages were arranged by the state to produce the strongest possible offspring, with physical fitness and genetic health taking precedence over family connections or personal preferences. Women typically married in their late teens or early 20s, much older than in other Greek cities, because the state wanted them to be fully mature and physically developed before beginning childbearing. The ideal of arete, excellence, or virtue permeated every aspect of Spartan education and society. But Spartan arete was defined very specifically in terms of military effectiveness and collective service. Individual talents, creative impulses, or intellectual curiosity that didn't directly contribute to military capability were not just ignored, they were actively suppressed as dangerous distractions. This created a society that was remarkably effective at its chosen purpose, but severely limited in other dimensions of human development. Spartans produced no great philosophers, poets, or artists. They built no magnificent temples or public buildings. They made no significant contributions to science, mathematics, or literature. All of their creative energy was channeled into the single goal of military excellence. The psychological cost of this system was enormous. The Agoge produced warriors who were extraordinarily effective in battle, but often struggled to function in peacetime situations. They were trained to be aggressive, decisive, and ruthless, qualities that served them well in combat but made them poorly suited for diplomacy, trade, or the normal social interactions that characterized life in other Greek cities. The boys who survived the Agoge, and not all did, emerged as young men who had been systematically stripped of individual identity and rebuilt as components in a military machine. They thought of themselves not as separate people with personal goals and desires, but as interchangeable parts in a collective organism whose sole purpose was warfare. This transformation was so complete that former enemies often commented on the peculiar uniformity of Spartan behavior. Unlike other Greeks who displayed the full range of human personality types, Spartans seem to have been manufactured rather than born. They moved, spoke, and acted with a coordination that impressed and unnerved observers from more individualistic societies. The Agoge represented perhaps the most systematic attempt in human history to reshape human nature according to specific social requirements. It demonstrated both the tremendous potential and the horrific costs of comprehensive social engineering. The boys who entered the system as 7-year-olds emerged as some of the most effective warriors the world had ever seen, but they had paid for this effectiveness with their individuality, creativity, and emotional range. As these products of the Agoge reached adulthood, they would take their place in Spartan society as full warriors, ready to defend their city-state against any threat, but they would also carry within them the psychological scars and limitations created by their childhood conditioning, limitations that would ultimately contribute to Sparta's decline and fall. The Agoge was both Sparta's greatest achievement and its fundamental weakness. It solved the immediate problem of producing superior warriors, but it created long-term problems that would eventually prove insurmountable. The same system that made Sparta militarily dominant also made it inflexible, culturally sterile, and ultimately unable to adapt to changing circumstances. The children who suffered through this extraordinary system became the foundation of Spartan power, but they also carried within them the seeds of Spartan destruction. Their story is a testament to both human adaptability and the dangerous extremes to which societies can go in pursuit of their chosen goals. Graduating from the Agoge didn't mean freedom. It meant entering an even more restrictive adult existence, where every aspect of daily life was regulated by the state. At 20, after 13 years of brutal conditioning, young Spartan men finally earned the right to call themselves warriors. But becoming a full citizen required something more: surviving another decade of military service, and proving worthy of membership in a syssitia, one of the communal dining groups that formed the backbone of adult Spartan society. The syssitia weren't just meal clubs, they were the fundamental building blocks of Spartan military and social organization. These groups of about 15 men ate together every single day, sharing simple food and reinforcing the bonds of brotherhood that had been forged in the Agoge. No Spartan, regardless of royal blood or military achievement, could claim full citizenship without acceptance into one of these groups. Getting into a syssitia required unanimous approval from existing members, making it one of the most exclusive clubs in human history. A single negative vote, cast by dropping a black ball into an urn, could destroy a young warrior's hopes of full citizenship. This wasn't just social exclusion, it was political and economic death. Without syssitia membership, a Spartan couldn't participate in the citizen assembly, couldn't hold public office, and couldn't marry or own property. The daily routine of syssitia life reflected the same austere values that had defined the Agoge. Meals consisted of the infamous black broth, a soup made from pork, blood, salt and vinegar that was so unpalatable that visitors from other Greek cities couldn't choke it down. When a foreign dignitary complained about the taste, a Spartan reportedly replied that you had to exercise at the gymnasium and bathe in the Eurotas River to develop an appetite for it. This wasn't about cuisine. It was about maintaining the psychological conditioning that made Spartan warriors effective. Men who had grown comfortable with luxury food, soft beds and physical comfort were men who might hesitate when faced with the hardships of military campaigns. The deliberate austerity of adult life ensured that Spartans remained tough, focused, and ready for war at all times. The syssitia also served crucial military functions. These weren't random social groups, they were military units that would fight together in battle. The men who shared meals every day for decades developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's strengths, weaknesses, and battlefield behavior. This intimate knowledge made Spartan phalanx formations devastatingly effective, because each warrior knew exactly what his neighbors would do in any given situation. The economic foundation of syssitia membership revealed another layer of Spartan social control. Each member was required to contribute a specific amount of food each month: barley, wine, cheese, and figs, produced by his helot-worked estate. Failure to make these contributions resulted in immediate expulsion from the group and loss of citizenship rights. This system ensured that every full Spartan had a direct economic stake in maintaining the helot system. A citizen who couldn't extract sufficient surplus from his assigned helots couldn't maintain his membership in society's most basic institution. The system made every Spartan a stakeholder in the oppression that supported their military culture. The daily schedule of adult Spartans reinforced these military priorities. Citizens rose before dawn for physical exercise, practiced weapon skills in the morning, attended to brief civic duties in the afternoon, and gathered for their syssitia meal in the evening. Unlike citizens of other Greek cities, Spartans were forbidden from engaging in trade, crafts, or any economic activity that might distract from military preparation. This prohibition on commerce wasn't just cultural preference. It was systematic social engineering designed to prevent the development of individual wealth that might compromise collective loyalty. Spartans used iron bars as currency, deliberately making their money too heavy and cumbersome for normal commercial transactions. The message was clear: your energy should be spent on war, not on getting rich. The role of Spartan women in this system was unlike anything else in the ancient world. While women in other Greek cities lived in virtual seclusion, forbidden from appearing in public or managing property, Spartan women controlled vast estates, participated in religious ceremonies, and wielded significant behind-the-scenes political influence. This wasn't because Spartans believed in gender equality, it was because their military system required women to function as estate managers while their husbands spent most of their time in military training or on campaign. Spartan women couldn't afford to be decorative ornaments. They had to be tough, competent administrators, capable of managing complex agricultural operations and maintaining discipline among potentially rebellious helot workers. The marriage customs of Sparta reflected these practical necessities. Unlike other Greek cities where marriages were primarily economic arrangements between families, Spartan marriages were state-controlled breeding programs designed to produce the strongest possible offspring. Physical fitness, health, and genetic quality took precedence over family connections or personal preferences. Spartan wedding ceremonies were deliberately austere and militaristic. The bride's head was shaved and she was dressed in men's clothing, symbolically representing her transition from individual identity to state service. The groom had to capture his bride in a mock raid, emphasizing the martial character of the relationship. The couple then lived separately for years, meeting only secretly for procreation until the husband completed his military service obligations. This bizarre arrangement served several purposes. It maintained the primacy of military brotherhood over family bonds, ensured that young warriors weren't distracted by domestic concerns during their most intensive training years, and created an element of excitement and novelty that supposedly encouraged more frequent intercourse and higher pregnancy rates. Spartan women were expected to maintain strict physical fitness throughout their lives, not just during their childbearing years. They participated in athletic competitions, practiced gymnastics, and engaged in physical conditioning that scandalized visitors from other Greek cities. Foreign observers were particularly shocked by the sight of Spartan women exercising in the nude alongside men, a practice that violated every norm of Greek feminine behavior. But this physical culture served practical military purposes. Strong mothers were more likely to survive childbirth and produce healthy babies. Women who maintained their fitness were better able to manage estates, supervise helot workers, and defend their homes during military emergencies. Most importantly, physically and mentally tough women were more likely to raise sons who could survive the Agoge and become effective warriors. The reproductive policies of Sparta were essentially a state-run eugenics program designed to optimize military capability. Older men were encouraged to share their wives with younger, fitter men if it might produce stronger children. Brothers were expected to share wives in certain circumstances. Childless couples faced social ostracism and legal penalties, while families that produced multiple healthy sons received honors and privileges. These policies weren't motivated by modern scientific understanding of genetics. They were based on practical observation that strong parents tended to produce strong children. The state had a direct interest in the physical quality of each generation, and reproductive choices were too important to be left to individual preference. The political structure of Sparta reflected the same balance between individual excellence and collective control that characterized every other aspect of their society. The dual kingship system ensured that no single person could accumulate too much power, while providing experienced military leadership for both domestic and foreign campaigns. The two kings came from different royal families, the Aegeans and the Eurypontids, who claimed descent from Heracles and the original Dorian conquerors. This wasn't just genealogical mythology, it was political legitimacy based on the foundational story of Spartan society. The kings weren't absolute rulers, but they weren't mere figureheads either. They commanded armies in war, served as high priests in religious ceremonies, and provided continuity of leadership across generations. The ephors, 5 annually elected officials, served as a crucial check on royal power. These weren't hereditary positions or lifetime appointments. They were temporary offices filled by ordinary citizens who could challenge kings, investigate corruption, and ensure that even the highest-ranking Spartans followed the law. The ephorate was one of the few democratic elements in an otherwise hierarchical system. Each morning, the kings and ephors exchanged ritual oaths that captured the essence of Spartan political culture. The kings swore to rule according to the laws of the city, while the ephors swore to preserve the kingship as long as it remained lawful. This daily ceremony reinforced the principle that even supreme authority was subject to collective rules and expectations. The Gerousia, the council of elders composed of men over 60, provided institutional memory and wisdom to balance the potential rashness of younger leaders. Membership was for life and highly prestigious, reserved for Spartans who had demonstrated exceptional military service and sound judgment over decades of citizenship. The Gerousia served as both a supreme court and a legislative council, with the power to propose laws and try cases involving serious crimes. This complex system of overlapping authorities created a government that was remarkably stable by ancient standards. Unlike other Greek cities that were constantly torn by civil wars and political upheavals, Sparta maintained essentially the same constitutional system for over 3 centuries. The balance between different institutions prevented any single group from accumulating dangerous amounts of power, while ensuring effective decision-making in crisis situations. The citizen assembly, the ecclesia, included all adult male Spartans, but its role was limited to approving or rejecting proposals made by the kings and Gerousia. Decisions were made, not by formal voting but by shouting, with the loudest group determining the outcome. This wasn't sophisticated democratic procedure, but it did ensure that major policies had the support of the warrior class that would have to implement them. The limitations of this political system reflected the broader constraints of Spartan society. The exclusive focus on military effectiveness created a government that was excellent at making war-related decisions, but poorly equipped to handle complex economic, diplomatic, or cultural challenges. The same institutional conservatism that provided political stability also made it difficult to adapt to changing circumstances. Religious life in Sparta reinforced these political and military values. The state cult centered around gods of war, victory, and death, with elaborate festivals celebrating martial virtues and honoring fallen warriors. The most important religious ceremonies were directly connected to military activities, purification rituals before campaigns, victory celebrations after battles, and funeral rites for warriors who died in service to the state. The Hyacinthia festival demonstrated how Spartan religion integrated military and civilian life. This three-day celebration honored Hyacinthus, a local deity associated with the agricultural cycle, but it also included military parades, weapons displays, and competitions that reinforced warrior values. Even religious observances became opportunities for military training and social bonding. The daily rhythm of Spartan religious practice emphasized collective rather than individual spirituality. Citizens participated in group ceremonies that reinforced social unity and shared values, rather than developing personal relationships with the gods. Prayer and sacrifice were community activities that strengthened the bonds between warriors, rather than expressions of individual faith or devotion. The economic life of adult Spartans was deliberately limited to prevent the development of individual wealth that might compromise collective loyalty. Citizens were forbidden from engaging in trade, manufacturing, or any commercial activity. The periarchoi handled all economic functions that required specialized skills or business relationships, while helots provided agricultural labor. This economic system created a society of professional warriors who were completely dependent on others for their material needs. Spartans couldn't feed themselves, couldn't make their own weapons or tools, and couldn't engage in the commercial relationships that were normal parts of life in other Greek cities. This dependency was intentional. It ensured that citizens remained focused on military activities, while creating powerful incentives to maintain the social system that supported their lifestyle. The psychological cost of this adult lifestyle was enormous. Men who had been conditioned from childhood to suppress individual desires and submit to collective authority often struggled with the limited emotional range and creative expression that characterized Spartan culture. The constant emphasis on military readiness created a society of warriors who were extraordinarily effective in battle, but often poorly adapted to peaceful pursuits. Foreign visitors consistently remarked on the peculiar uniformity of Spartan behavior and the apparent absence of individual personality that characterized other Greek societies. This wasn't accidental. It was the intended result of a comprehensive social system designed to subordinate individual identity to collective military effectiveness. The isolation of Spartan society from broader Greek cultural developments became increasingly pronounced during the classical period, while other cities were developing philosophy, drama, architecture, and science. Spartans remained focused exclusively on military activities. This cultural narrowness was both a source of strength and a fundamental weakness that would eventually contribute to their decline. Life as a Spartan citizen was a remarkable achievement in social engineering, the creation of a society that successfully subordinated individual interests to collective military goals. But it was also a demonstration of the human cost of such extreme social control. The men who emerged from this system were effective warriors, but they were also psychologically constrained individuals who had sacrificed much of what makes life meaningful in pursuit of military excellence. The adult Spartan lived in a world where every aspect of existence was regulated by the state, where individual desires were subordinated to collective needs, and where military effectiveness was the sole measure of human worth. It was a life that produced remarkable warriors but impoverished human beings, a society that achieved its immediate goals while creating long-term problems that would eventually prove insurmountable. The Spartan state didn't exist in isolation. It was built on a foundation of systematic oppression that required constant vigilance and periodic violence to maintain. The relationship between the Spartan citizen elite and their various subject populations reveals the brutal arithmetic that made their military society possible. For every Spartan warrior, there were perhaps 10 helots working the land, plus additional periarchoi, providing manufactured goods and military support. This demographic reality shaped every aspect of Spartan foreign and domestic policy. The city-state couldn't afford extended military campaigns that left the homeland undefended, couldn't risk defeats that might encourage Helot rebellions, and couldn't allow any development that might destabilize the delicate balance of terror that kept their subject populations in line. The Helot system was unlike any other form of slavery in the ancient world. Unlike chattel slaves who were individually owned and could be bought and sold, Helots were tied to specific plots of land and belonged to the Spartan state collectively. They couldn't be sold away from their families or transported to distant locations, but they also had no legal rights, no freedom of movement, and lived under the constant threat of violence. The majority of Helots were Messenians, descendants of the population conquered during Sparta's expansion westward in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. Messenia was some of the most fertile agricultural land in the Peloponnese, capable of supporting a large population and generating the agricultural surplus necessary to free Spartan citizens from productive labor. But conquering this territory had required brutal warfare that created lasting resentment among the defeated population. The First Messenian War, fought sometime in the late 8th century BCE, established Spartan control over much of Messenia, but it didn't eliminate Messenian resistance. The conquered population retained their cultural identity, their memories of independence, and their hatred of their Spartan overlords. This created a permanent security threat that required constant attention and periodic suppression. The Helots vastly outnumbered their Spartan masters, creating a demographic time bomb that could explode at any moment of weakness or distraction. Ancient sources suggest that Helots outnumbered full Spartan citizens by ratios as high as 10 or 15 to 1, meaning that any general uprising would have devastating consequences for the citizen population. To manage this threat, the Spartans developed a comprehensive system of control that combined economic incentives, divide and conquer tactics, and systematic terrorism. Helots were allowed to keep a portion of their agricultural production, giving them some stake in the system's continuation. They were divided into different groups with slightly different privileges, preventing the development of unified resistance, and they were subjected to periodic campaigns of intimidation and murder, designed to eliminate potential leaders and maintain an atmosphere of fear. The most notorious of these control mechanisms was the Crypteia, a secretive program in which young Spartans spent time in the countryside hunting and killing Helots. This wasn't random violence. It was targeted assassination designed to eliminate the strongest, smartest, and most potentially dangerous members of the Helot population. The program served the dual purpose of providing advanced military training for young Spartans while culling the Helot population of natural leaders. The Crypteia operated under special legal protections that made killing Helots not just permissible but officially encouraged. Each year, the Ephors formally declared war on the Helot population, making any violence against them a legitimate act of war rather than murder. This legal framework allowed Spartans to kill Helots without religious pollution or legal consequences, removing moral and practical barriers to systematic oppression. Despite these control mechanisms, Helot rebellions were a constant threat that occasionally erupted into full-scale wars that tested Spartan military capability to its limits. The most serious of these was the Great Helot Revolt that began around 464 BCE, sparked by a devastating earthquake that killed thousands of Spartans and left the city temporarily vulnerable. The earthquake struck during the morning, when most Spartan citizens were gathered in public spaces for daily exercise and civic activities. Entire buildings collapsed, crushing many of the city's military elite and creating an opportunity that the Helots were quick to exploit. Within days of the disaster, Helot communities throughout Laconia and Messenia were in open rebellion, coordinating attacks on isolated Spartan outposts and threatening to overwhelm the weakened citizen population. The rebellion revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Spartan system. The surviving citizens responded with remarkable discipline and effectiveness, immediately implementing emergency procedures that had been planned for exactly this type of crisis. But the revolt also demonstrated how precarious Spartan control really was, how dependent their entire society was on maintaining the appearance of invincible strength. The war that followed lasted for several years and required significant outside assistance before the Spartans could restore control. The Helots fortified themselves on Mount Ithome, the same mountain stronghold that had served as a center of resistance during the original Messenian Wars centuries earlier. From this position, they conducted a guerrilla campaign that tied down Spartan forces and threatened to inspire additional uprisings throughout the Peloponnese. The Spartans were eventually forced to request military assistance from their allies, including Athens, marking one of the few times in their history that they admitted to needing outside help for internal security. The fact that they had to ask for help revealed the limitations of their military system when faced with prolonged irregular warfare, rather than the set-piece battles for which they were trained. The resolution of the Helot revolt demonstrated both Spartan pragmatism and the limits of their control. Rather than continuing a costly war of attrition, the Spartans eventually negotiated a settlement that allowed the rebel leaders to evacuate Mount Ithome and relocate to territories outside the Peloponnese. This was a remarkable admission of weakness from a society that prided itself on never compromising with enemies. The Helot revolts also revealed the crucial role played by the Perioikoi in maintaining Spartan power. These free but non-citizen communities provided essential military support during emergencies, contributed manufactured goods that Spartans were forbidden to produce, and served as a buffer between the citizen elite and the Helot masses. The Perioikoi occupied a unique position in the Spartan system. They were free men who could own property, engage in trade, and manage their own local affairs, but they had no political rights in the Spartan state and were required to provide military service when called upon. Most Perioikoi communities were descendants of early inhabitants of the region who had negotiated favorable terms during the Dorian conquest, or later Dorian arrivals who had come too late to claim full citizenship. This intermediate status made the Perioikoi natural allies of the Spartan system. Their privileged position relative to the Helots gave them a stake in maintaining the existing order, while their exclusion from full citizenship prevented them from challenging Spartan political control. They served as a middle class that provided essential services while posing no threat to the warrior elite. The Perioikoi were particularly important in providing manufactured goods and military equipment. Since Spartan citizens were forbidden from engaging in trade or crafts, the Perioikoi filled this crucial economic niche. They produced weapons, armor, tools, and luxury goods, operated mines and quarries, and managed the commercial relationships that connected Sparta to the broader Greek economy. During military emergencies, Perioikoi communities were expected to provide troops that fought alongside Spartan citizens. These weren't second-class auxiliaries. Perioikoi soldiers were well-trained and well-equipped fighters who served in the same phalanx formations as citizens. The combined forces of citizens and Perioikoi gave Sparta a larger military base than the small citizen population alone could provide. The expansion into Messenia represented the high point of Spartan territorial ambition and the foundation of their classical power. The Second Messenian War, fought in the 7th century BCE, completed the conquest of this fertile region and provided the agricultural base necessary to support the full development of Spartan military culture. The conquest of Messenia was a generational struggle that required sustained military effort over several decades. The Messenians weren't primitive tribes that could be easily overrun. They were organized Greek communities with their own military traditions and strong defensive positions. The wars required innovations in Spartan military tactics, improvements in equipment and training, and the development of the logistical capabilities necessary to sustain long-term campaigns. The successful conquest of Messenia transformed Sparta from a regional power into the dominant force in the Peloponnese. The addition of Messenian agricultural production meant that Sparta could support a larger citizen population and more intensive military training. The conquest also provided additional Helot laborers and Perioikoi communities that strengthened the economic foundation of Spartan society. But the Messenian conquest also created the demographic imbalance that would plague Sparta for the rest of its history. The addition of a large recently conquered population meant that Helots now vastly outnumbered citizens, creating security challenges that would absorb an increasing amount of Spartan military resources in the centuries that followed. The foundation of the Peloponnesian League represented Sparta's solution to the problem of extending influence without the risks of direct territorial expansion. Rather than conquering additional territories and absorbing more potentially rebellious populations, Sparta created a network of allied city-states that provided military support while maintaining their own internal autonomy. The Peloponnesian League wasn't a formal empire with governors and tribute payments. It was a military alliance based on mutual defense agreements and shared strategic interests. Member cities maintained their own governments, laws, and customs, but were required to provide military support when Sparta went to war and to follow Spartan leadership in foreign policy matters. This system allowed Sparta to project power throughout the Peloponnese without the administrative costs and security risks of direct rule. Allied cities had incentives to remain loyal because Spartan protection was valuable, but they also had enough autonomy to maintain their own identities and interests. The arrangement provided Sparta with a larger military base while avoiding the demographic problems that would have resulted from incorporating additional helot populations. The success of the Peloponnesian League demonstrated Spartan diplomatic skill that often gets overlooked in accounts that focus on their military prowess. Creating and maintaining this alliance required careful attention to the interests of different member cities, skillful negotiation of disputes between allies, and the ability to project just enough power to maintain leadership without triggering rebellions. The League also revealed the limitations of Spartan power projection. While Sparta could dominate the Peloponnese through this alliance system, extending influence beyond the peninsula was much more difficult. The demographic constraints of their society meant that Sparta couldn't sustain long-term military commitments in distant territories, and their cultural isolation made it difficult to understand and influence non-Peloponnesian Greek communities. Spartan isolationism wasn't just cultural preference, it was strategic necessity imposed by the requirements of internal security. Every Spartan warrior who left the homeland was a warrior who wasn't available to suppress helot uprisings or defend against invasions. This created powerful incentives to avoid foreign entanglements that might leave the homeland vulnerable. The isolationist tendency was reinforced by Spartan cultural conservatism and suspicion of foreign influences. Citizens who traveled extensively or developed relationships with non-Spartans were viewed with suspicion as potentially corrupted by outside ideas. The state actively discouraged foreign travel, limited contact with foreign visitors, and maintained cultural barriers that prevented the kind of intellectual and economic exchange that characterized other Greek cities. This isolationism had both advantages and costs. It helped preserve the unique characteristics of Spartan society and prevented the development of outside loyalties that might compromise citizen dedication to the state. But it also limited Spartan understanding of developments in the broader Greek world and made it difficult to adapt to changing strategic circumstances. The military deterrent effect of Spartan power was perhaps their greatest strategic asset. The reputation of Spartan warriors was so formidable that potential enemies often chose not to challenge them directly, allowing Sparta to achieve strategic goals without actually fighting. This deterrent effect was carefully cultivated through selective displays of military power and the systematic cultivation of their fearsome reputation. The deterrent value of Spartan military power was multiplied by their willingness to use extreme violence when challenged. Unlike other Greek cities that might negotiate, compromise, or seek face-saving solutions to conflicts, Spartans had a reputation for fighting to the finish and showing no mercy to defeated enemies. This reputation made other cities much more willing to negotiate rather than fight, but maintaining deterrent credibility required occasional demonstrations of military power that could be costly and risky. Sparta had to be willing to fight when challenged, even when the strategic stakes were relatively minor, because any appearance of weakness might encourage broader challenges to their regional hegemony. The relationship between Sparta and her neighbors was thus a complex balance of oppression, alliance, and deterrence. The internal foundation of helot labor and perioikoi support made possible the military machine that dominated the Peloponnese, while the external alliance system and deterrent reputation allowed Sparta to maintain regional hegemony without overextending their limited military resources. This system worked remarkably well for several centuries, allowing a small population of citizen warriors to dominate a much larger region through a combination of military excellence and strategic skill. But the system also contained internal contradictions and limitations that would eventually contribute to Spartan decline. The demographic imbalance with the helots created permanent security challenges, the isolationist tendencies limited adaptability, and the exclusive focus on military power made it difficult to respond to non-military challenges. The stage was being set for the great test that would define Spartan identity for all time, the the Persian Wars that would provide the ultimate demonstration of Spartan military valor, while also revealing the limitations of their strategic approach. The relationship with their neighbors had created the foundation for Spartan power, but it had also created constraints that would shape their response to the greatest external threat they had ever faced. The year was 480 BCE, and the largest military force the world had ever seen was marching toward Greece. Xerxes, the king of kings, ruler of an empire that stretched from India to Egypt, had assembled over 1 million soldiers, sailors, and support personnel for the conquest of Europe. His father Darius had failed to subdue the Greeks at Marathon 10 years earlier, a humiliating defeat that demanded vengeance and threatened the prestige of Persian imperial power. But for the Spartans, this wasn't just another war. It was the ultimate test of everything their society stood for. For 3 centuries, they had shaped their entire civilization around the production of superior warriors. Now they would discover whether their extreme military culture could stand against the resources of the world's greatest empire. The Persian threat had been building for decades. The Persian Empire had been expanding westward since the 6th century BCE, absorbing Greek cities along the Anatolian coast and establishing a presence that threatened the independence of mainland Greece. The failed Persian invasion at Marathon in 490 BCE had been more of a reconnaissance in force than a serious conquest attempt. A test of Greek resistance that revealed both weaknesses and strengths in the fragmented city-state system. Xerxes' invasion was different. This was total war, a massive coordinated assault designed to crush Greek resistance once and for all. The Persian force included not just the elite immortals, the 10,000 professional soldiers who formed the core of Persian military power, but also contingents from dozens of subject peoples throughout the empire. Persians, Medes, Scythians, Indians, Egyptians, and Phoenicians marched together in a display of imperial power that was designed to terrify enemies into submission without fighting. The logistics of this invasion were staggering. Persian engineers had built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont to transport the army from Asia into Europe. They had dug a canal through the Mount Athos Peninsula to allow their fleet to avoid the dangerous waters that had destroyed an earlier Persian naval force. Supply depots had been established throughout Thrace and Macedonia to feed the enormous army as it marched towards central Greece. The Greek response revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their city-state system. When faced with existential threat, the normally fractious Greeks were capable of remarkable cooperation. Athens and Sparta, traditional rivals with fundamentally different political systems, managed to coordinate their efforts and create a unified command structure. Smaller cities throughout central and southern Greece contributed troops, ships, and supplies to the common defense. But Greek unity was fragile and incomplete. Many cities remained neutral, waiting to see which side would win before committing themselves. Others actively collaborated with the Persians, either from fear or from calculation that Persian rule might be preferable to domination by other Greek cities. The northern Greeks, Thessalians, Macedonians, and Thracians had already submitted to Persian authority, providing the invaders with local guides and additional troops. The strategic situation facing the Greek alliance was daunting. The Persian army was so large that it couldn't be defeated in a single battle. Greek forces were simply too small to match Persian numbers in open combat. The Persian navy controlled the seas, making it impossible to cut Persian supply lines or prevent flanking movements along the coast. The only hope was to find defensive positions where geography could offset the Persian numerical advantage. The pass at Thermopylae, the hot gates, provided exactly the kind of defensive position the Greeks needed. This narrow coastal passage between mountains and sea was the only practical route for a large army moving from northern into central Greece. The pass was so narrow that it eliminated the Persian advantage in numbers, forcing them to attack frontally against prepared defensive positions. The Greek strategy was sophisticated and realistic. They never intended to win a decisive victory at Thermopylae. The position was meant to delay the Persian advance while the main Greek forces prepared defenses further south. By forcing the Persians to spend time and casualties reducing a strong defensive position, the Greeks hoped to disrupt Persian timing and demonstrate that Greek resistance was serious enough to require major efforts to overcome. King Leonidas of Sparta was chosen to command the advance force at Thermopylae, a selection that reflected both Spartan military prestige and the political realities of the Greek alliance. As one of Sparta's two kings, Leonidas had the authority to make strategic decisions without consulting higher authority. His Spartan troops provided a core of professional warriors whose reputation might inspire confidence among the allied forces. But Leonidas didn't arrive at Thermopylae with just 300 Spartans, despite what popular culture suggests. His force included several thousand troops from various Greek cities, Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, and others who were committed to the defense of central Greece. The 300 Spartans were the elite core of this force, but they were supported by a much larger Greek army. The selection of the 300 Spartans who accompanied Leonidas reveals important aspects of Spartan military culture and political calculation. These weren't necessarily the 300 best warriors in Sparta. They were 300 warriors who met specific criteria that reflected Spartan social values and strategic thinking. Each of the 300 had living sons, ensuring that their family lines would continue even if they died in battle. This wasn't just about genetics, it was about maintaining the citizen population that was essential to Spartan power. The state couldn't afford to lose potential fathers whose deaths might contribute to demographic decline. The 300 were also selected for their political reliability and social standing within Spartan society. These were men whose families had demonstrated unwavering loyalty to the Spartan system, who had distinguished themselves in previous military service, and who could be trusted to maintain discipline and cohesion under extreme stress. The decision to send exactly 300 warriors, a single company rather than a larger force, reflected practical constraints rather than symbolic gestures. Sparta was in the middle of celebrating the Komania, a religious festival that traditionally prohibited military campaigns. Sending a larger force would have violated religious law and risked divine displeasure. The 300 represented the minimum force necessary to maintain Spartan honor while technically observing religious restrictions. But this limited deployment also reflected deeper strategic calculations. Sparta couldn't commit its entire military force to a defensive battle in central Greece, because the Helot population required constant supervision. Stripping too many warriors from the homeland might encourage Helot uprisings that could be more dangerous than Persian invasion. The 300 represented the maximum force Sparta could safely deploy without compromising internal security. The battle itself unfolded over 3 days of increasingly desperate fighting. The first day demonstrated the effectiveness of Greek defensive tactics and the quality of Spartan military training. The Persians launched repeated frontal attacks against the Greek phalanx, but their numbers meant nothing in the narrow confines of the pass. Wave after wave of Persian infantry broke against the Greek spear wall, unable to bring their superior numbers to bear. The Persian attacks weren't random or poorly coordinated. They represented sophisticated attempts to break through Greek defenses using different tactical approaches. Persian archers attempted to suppress Greek resistance with massive arrow volleys, but the Greeks simply raised their shields and waited for the archery to stop before resuming fighting. Persian cavalry tried to flank the position, but the terrain made mounted attacks impossible. Most tellingly, Xerxes committed his elite immortals to the assault, expecting that his best troops would be able to break through where regular infantry had failed. But the immortals discovered that individual courage and skill meant nothing against well-organized collective resistance. The Greek phalanx wasn't just a military formation. It was a tactical system that multiplied individual effectiveness through disciplined cooperation. The second day of fighting saw more of the same, with Persian forces becoming increasingly frustrated and demoralized by their inability to make progress against the Greek position. Persian tactical doctrine was based on the assumption that superior numbers and individual heroics could overcome any defensive position. The Thermopylae revealed the limitations of this approach against disciplined collective resistance. The deadlock was broken not by military genius, but by betrayal. A local Greek named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path that allowed them to outflank the Greek position and attack from the rear. This wasn't a secret route known only to locals. The Greeks had posted a force of Phocians to guard it, but the Phocians abandoned their position when attacked, allowing the Persian flanking force to reach the rear of the main Greek position. When Leonidas realized that his position had been compromised, he faced a crucial decision that would define Spartan identity for the next 2 millennia. He could order a general retreat that would save most of his forces for future battles, or he could make a last stand that would mean certain death for his entire command. The decision to fight to the death wasn't made from blind heroism or death-seeking fanaticism. It was a calculated choice based on Spartan military doctrine and strategic thinking. Retreating would save lives in the short term, but it would also send a message that Spartans could be intimidated and defeated. This might encourage Persian-friendly factions throughout Greece and undermine the morale of Greek forces preparing for future battles. By choosing to die rather than retreat, Leonidas and his 300 sent a different message, that Spartans would never surrender, never compromise, and never accept defeat as long as they had the strength to fight. This wasn't just propaganda, it was strategic communication designed to influence the broader course of the war. The final phase of the battle saw the surrounded Greeks fighting with desperate courage against overwhelming odds. They knew they were going to die, but they were determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible. According to later accounts, the Greeks ran out of spears and fought with swords, then with bare hands when their swords broke. Leonidas himself fell early in the final assault, and much of the remaining fighting centered around recovering his body. In Greek military culture, abandoning a fallen leader's corpse was considered the ultimate dishonor, and both sides understood the symbolic importance of controlling the king's body. The battle became a savage melee, as Greeks and Persians fought over the physical remains of Spartan leadership. When the fighting finally ended, the Persian victory was complete but costly. The narrow pass was choked with Persian dead, and Xerxes had lost some of his best troops in what should have been a simple mop-up operation. More importantly, the 3-day delay had disrupted Persian timing and demonstrated that Greek resistance was far from broken. The immediate strategic impact of Thermopylae was limited. Persians had broken through the Greek defensive line and could now advance into central Greece. Athens was evacuated and burned, and it appeared that Persian victory was inevitable. But the battle had psychological and political consequences that were far more important than its immediate tactical results. Throughout the Greek world, the story of Leonidas and the 300 became a symbol of heroic resistance against impossible odds. Cities that had been wavering in their loyalty to the Greek cause were inspired by Spartan sacrifice to continue fighting. Persian-friendly factions found it harder to argue for collaboration when Spartan courage had demonstrated that Greeks could match Persian soldiers in battle. The battle also revealed important truths about Persian military power that would influence the rest of the war. Despite their vast numbers and impressive logistics, the Persians weren't invincible. Their tactical doctrine was poorly adapted to fighting disciplined Greek infantry in defensive positions. Their reliance on subject peoples created coordination problems and morale issues that could be exploited by determined resistance. For Sparta itself, Thermopylae became the defining moment that justified 3 centuries of military culture and social engineering. Every harsh aspect of Spartan society, the helot system, the Agoge, the military lifestyle, could now be defended as necessary preparation for moments like this. The 300 had demonstrated that Spartan warriors were indeed superior to any other soldiers in the world, but the battle also revealed the limitations of Spartan military power. The 300 had fought magnificently and died heroically, but they had also been defeated. Superior individual training and courage weren't enough to overcome massive numerical disadvantage and strategic encirclement. The Spartan military system produced excellent warriors, but it couldn't produce enough warriors to single-handedly defend Greece against the Persian Empire. The aftermath of Thermopylae saw Spartan military reputation reach its historical peak, while also beginning the process that would eventually limit Spartan power. The story of the battle became a recruiting tool that attracted the best young warriors from throughout the Greek world to seek training in Sparta, but it also created expectations of Spartan military performance that would be difficult to maintain over time. The battle demonstrated both the power and the fragility of reputation-based deterrence. The 300 had enhanced Spartan military prestige to unprecedented levels, but this prestige now had to be maintained through continued military success. Any future defeats would be measured against the standard of Thermopylae, making it increasingly difficult for Sparta to acknowledge limitations or accept compromises. Thermopylae thus marked both the climax and the beginning of the end of classical Spartan power. The battle provided the ultimate validation of Spartan military culture, but it also created pressures and expectations that the small citizen population couldn't sustain indefinitely. The 300 had died to preserve Greek freedom, but their sacrifice had also trapped Sparta in a reputation for invincibility that would eventually contribute to their downfall. The hot gates, had witnessed the birth of a legend that would inspire warriors for the next 2,000 years, but they had also revealed the mathematical realities that would ultimately defeat the Spartan system. Even the best warriors in the world couldn't overcome the simple fact that 300 is a smaller number than 100,000, no matter how courageously they fight. The victory over Persia should have been the beginning of a golden age for Sparta. They had proven their military superiority on the world stage, saved Greek civilization from foreign conquest, and emerged as the undisputed leaders of the Greek military alliance. But victory brought unexpected problems that the Spartan system was poorly equipped to handle, and within 50 years of Thermopylae, Sparta would find itself locked in a death struggle with its former ally Athens. The transformation of Athens from Spartan ally to existential enemy wasn't the result of a single dramatic betrayal. It was the inevitable consequence of two fundamentally incompatible approaches to power and civilization. Where Sparta had created a military society focused on land-based control of the Peloponnese, Athens had developed a commercial empire based on naval power and maritime trade. These two systems were bound to collide as both cities expanded their spheres of influence. The seeds of conflict were planted immediately after the Persian withdrawal. While Sparta was content to return to its traditional isolationism, once the foreign threat had been eliminated, Athens saw the Persian retreat as an opportunity for expansion. The Athenians understood that Persia might return, and they were determined to build a defensive system that could prevent future invasions while also advancing Athenian economic and political interests. The creation of the Delian League in 478 BCE marked the beginning of Athens' transformation from city-state to empire. Ostensibly a defensive alliance designed to prevent Persian return, the League quickly became a vehicle for Athenian expansion and wealth accumulation. Island and coastal cities throughout the Aegean Sea were required to contribute either ships or money to the common defense, with Athens controlling the League's treasury and military leadership. The Delian League represented everything that Spartan political culture opposed. It was an innovative institution that broke with traditional Greek practices. It was based on commercial relationships and monetary contributions rather than traditional military obligations. It encouraged cultural exchange and intellectual development that Spartans viewed as corrupting foreign influences. Most dangerously, it was expanding Athenian power and influence throughout the Greek world. Sparta watched this Athenian expansion with growing alarm, but initially couldn't decide how to respond. The Spartan political system was designed for making military decisions, not for handling complex diplomatic and economic challenges. The dual kingship, council of elders, and citizen assembly were effective institutions for managing traditional warfare, but they were poorly adapted to the kind of long-term strategic planning that would be necessary to counter Athenian expansion. The demographic constraints that had always limited Spartan options became increasingly problematic as Athens grew stronger. Sparta couldn't match Athenian naval power because Helot security requirements prevented the deployment of large numbers of citizens on extended overseas campaigns. They couldn't compete economically because Spartan citizens were forbidden to engage in trade or commercial activities. They couldn't counter Athenian cultural influence because their isolationist policies limited contact with the broader Greek world. The first direct clash came in 460 BCE, when Athens began supporting Helot rebels and other enemies of Sparta. This wasn't just diplomatic maneuvering, it was a direct attack on the foundation of Spartan society. If Athens could encourage successful Helot uprisings, the entire Spartan social system would collapse. The threat was existential, requiring a military response despite Spartan preferences for avoiding foreign entanglements. The First Peloponnesian War lasted 15 years and ended in a stalemate that satisfied neither side. Sparta demonstrated that it could defend its homeland and maintain control over its Helot population, but couldn't prevent Athenian expansion in other regions. Athens proved that it could project power throughout the Greek world and build a profitable maritime empire, but couldn't defeat Sparta on land or break the Peloponnesian League. The 30 Years' Peace signed in 446 BCE was supposed to resolve these tensions by dividing Greece into separate spheres of influence. Sparta would dominate the Peloponnese and focus on land-based power, while Athens would control the seas and concentrate on maritime empire. Each side would respect the other's allies and avoid interference in the other's sphere of influence. But this peace was built on false assumptions about the nature of Athenian and Spartan expansion. Both systems had internal dynamics that required continued growth and success to maintain stability. Athens needed tribute from new allies to fund its democracy and naval power. Sparta needed to maintain its reputation for invincibility to prevent Helot rebellions and allied defections. Neither side could afford to appear weak or accept permanent limitations on its influence. The peace collapsed in 432 BCE over a seemingly minor dispute involving Corcyra, a naval power that both Athens and Sparta wanted as an ally. Specific details of the conflict were less important than what it represented. A fundamental incompatibility between two systems that had outgrown the traditional Greek city-state model and now threatened each other's existence. The Great Peloponnesian War that began in 431 BCE wasn't just another conflict between Greek cities. It was a struggle between two different visions of what Greek civilization should become. Athens represented innovation, democracy, commercial expansion, and cultural creativity. Sparta represented tradition, military excellence, political stability, and social discipline. Only one model could survive as the dominant force in the Greek world. Pericles, the Athenian leader, understood that Athens couldn't defeat Sparta in traditional land warfare. Instead, he developed a revolutionary strategy based on Athens' naval superiority and the defensive capabilities of the city's walls. Rather than meeting Spartan armies in open battle, Athens would withdraw behind its fortifications, use its navy to maintain supply lines, and conduct naval raids against Spartan territory and allies. This strategy was psychologically difficult for Athenians to accept, because it required watching Spartan armies devastate Athenian countryside without responding. But it was strategically sound because it played to Athenian strengths while avoiding Spartan advantages. If Athens could maintain its naval empire while avoiding decisive land battles, Sparta would eventually be forced to negotiate or exhaust itself in fruitless campaigns. The Spartan response revealed both the strengths and limitations of their military system. They could mobilize large armies quickly and devastate enemy territory effectively, but they had no answer to a strategy that avoided direct confrontation. Spartan warriors were trained for decisive battles, where superior individual skills and unit cohesion could determine outcomes, not for the kind of attritional warfare that the Athenian strategy required. The early years of the war demonstrated the fundamental mismatch between Spartan capabilities and strategic requirements. Annual invasions of Attica achieved nothing beyond destroying crops and buildings that could be rebuilt. Athenian naval raids caused more economic damage to Spartan territory than Spartan land campaigns caused to Athens. The war was becoming exactly the kind of prolonged, indecisive conflict that the Spartan system was least equipped to handle. The plague that struck Athens in 430 BCE seemed to offer Sparta an opportunity to achieve decisive victory without having to solve the strategic problems that had stymied their military efforts. The disease killed thousands of Athenians, including Pericles himself, and temporarily disrupted Athenian naval operations. But rather than capitalizing on this opportunity, Sparta continued its ineffective strategy of annual invasions that achieved no strategic goals. The failure to exploit Athenian weakness during the plague revealed a crucial limitation of the Spartan political system. The institutions that provided stability and prevented internal conflict also made it difficult to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The dual kingship, council of elders, and consensus-based decision-making that worked well for traditional military campaigns were poorly suited to the kind of flexible strategic thinking that the war required. The middle phase of the war saw both sides making strategic innovations that revealed their respective strengths and weaknesses. Athens developed new approaches to land warfare, including the use of light infantry and cavalry that could match Spartan mobility while avoiding direct confrontation with heavy infantry. Sparta began developing naval capabilities and seeking Persian financial support to compete with Athenian maritime power. The most significant Spartan innovation was the establishment of a permanent base at Decele in Athenian territory. Rather than conducting seasonal invasions that allowed Athens to recover between campaigns, Sparta maintained a year-round military presence that disrupted Athenian agriculture and forced Athens to maintain expensive defensive measures. This represented a major shift from traditional Spartan military practice, which had emphasized quick, decisive campaigns rather than prolonged occupation duties. The Deceleia strategy demonstrated both Spartan adaptability and the limitations of their military resources. The permanent base was strategically effective, but it required a continuous commitment of military manpower that strained Spartan demographic resources. Every warrior assigned to Decelia was a warrior who wasn't available for helot suppression, allied support, or response to other military challenges. The later phases of the war saw increasingly desperate expedients on both sides as the conflict dragged on far longer than either had anticipated. Athens attempted to break the stalemate with ambitious overseas campaigns, including the disastrous Sicilian expedition that cost them much of their navy and many of their best troops. Sparta began accepting Persian financial support and military advice, abandoning the isolationist principles that had previously defined their foreign policy. The Persian intervention was the decisive factor that finally gave Sparta the tools necessary to defeat Athens. Persian gold allowed Sparta to build and maintain a navy capable of challenging Athenian maritime supremacy. Persian diplomatic support helped Sparta encourage rebellions among Athenian allies who were tired of paying tribute and accepting Athenian political interference. But accepting Persian support came at enormous cost to Spartan principles and reputation. The city that had led Greek resistance against Persian invasion was now allied with Persia against fellow Greeks. The society that prided itself on military self-sufficiency was now dependent on foreign subsidies to maintain its war effort. The isolation that had preserved Spartan cultural purity was now compromised by the need to work with Persian officials and advisors. The final phase of the war demonstrated how thoroughly both Athens and Sparta had been transformed by their long conflict. Athens had abandoned its democratic ideals and was ruled by oligarchic factions supported by Spartan military power. Sparta had abandoned its traditional isolationism and was actively intervening in the internal affairs of cities throughout the Greek world. The decisive naval battle at Agoge in 405 BCE represented the ultimate irony of the Peloponnesian War. Sparta, the great land power, defeated Athens, the great naval power, in a sea battle that was won primarily through Persian financial support and strategic advice. The victory demonstrated Spartan determination and adaptability, but it also revealed how far they had moved from their original military culture. The siege and surrender of Athens in 404 BCE marked the end of the Athenian Empire and the beginning of Spartan hegemony over the Greek world. But the victory was hollow in many ways. Sparta had won the war, but only by abandoning many of the principles that had made them distinctive. They had gained control over territories they were poorly equipped to govern, and populations they didn't understand. The demographic cost of the 27-year war was catastrophic for Sparta. Hundreds of citizen warriors had died in battles throughout the Greek world, representing an irreplaceable loss to a society that was already struggling with declining birth rates and citizen numbers. The survivors were exhausted, many of them corrupted by exposure to foreign wealth and ideas that challenged traditional Spartan values. The economic consequences were equally serious. The war had required unprecedented military expenditures that had strained the Spartan system beyond its limits. The traditional helot-based economy that had supported Spartan military culture was no longer sufficient to maintain the kind of extended overseas commitments that hegemony required. Most importantly, the war had destroyed the conditions that had made Spartan military culture effective. The small, closed society that had produced superior warriors through intensive training and social conditioning was now responsible for governing a diverse empire that included millions of people with different traditions, languages, and political systems. The institutions that had worked well for managing a few thousand citizens were completely inadequate for imperial administration. The victory over Athens represented both the peak and the beginning of the end of Spartan power. They had demonstrated that their military system could adapt and prevail even against the most sophisticated enemies, but they had also revealed the fundamental limitations that would eventually lead to their decline. The war had forced Sparta to become something it was never designed to be. Governing power responsible for complex political and economic relationships throughout the Greek world. The Spartans had won the war, but in winning they had lost themselves. The society that emerged from the Peloponnesian War was still called Sparta, but it bore little resemblance to the unique military culture that had developed in the Eurotas Valley over the previous 3 centuries. The seeds of future defeat were planted in the moment of greatest victory, hidden beneath the celebration of triumph over their greatest rival. Victory over Athens should have inaugurated a golden age of Spartan dominance, but instead it marked the beginning of a rapid and irreversible decline that would reduce the most famous military state in history to a provincial curiosity within a single generation. The very success that had taken 27 years to achieve contained the seeds of destruction that would unravel 3 centuries of military excellence in less than 30 years. The immediate aftermath of the Peloponnesian War revealed how poorly equipped Sparta was for the responsibilities of hegemony. Their entire social system had been designed to produce warriors capable of defending a small territory against external threats and maintaining control over a subject population. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for governing an empire that stretched from the Black Sea to Sicily, managing complex economic relationships, or dealing with the sophisticated political problems that came with imperial power. The first signs of trouble appeared almost immediately. Spartan governors sent to rule former Athenian territories quickly developed reputations for corruption, incompetence, and brutality that made Athenian rule seem benevolent by comparison. These men had been trained from childhood to be warriors, not administrators, and they had no understanding of the diplomatic skills, economic knowledge, or cultural sensitivity required for effective governance. The traditional Spartan lifestyle, which had seemed like admirable austerity during wartime, appeared primitive and backward when compared to the sophisticated urban cultures they now ruled. Spartan officials were embarrassed by their lack of education, their cultural narrowness, and their inability to participate effectively in the intellectual and artistic life that characterized the cities they governed. More seriously, contact with the wealth and luxury of the former Athenian Empire began to corrupt the rigid social discipline that had been the foundation of Spartan military effectiveness. Warriors who had been content with simple food and basic clothing in their homeland were exposed to silk, fine wines, elaborate architecture, and all the material pleasures that their society had deliberately rejected. Some Spartans proved remarkably resistant to these temptations, maintaining their traditional lifestyle even when surrounded by luxury, but others were seduced by the possibilities of wealth and comfort that imperial rule offered. The accumulation of individual riches, strictly forbidden under traditional Spartan law, became increasingly common among the governing class. This corruption wasn't just a matter of personal morality, it was a systemic threat to the social engineering that made Spartan military culture possible. The entire system depended on maintaining equality among citizens and preventing the development of individual wealth that might compromise collective loyalty. Once some Spartans began to accumulate personal fortunes, the incentive structure that supported military excellence began to break down. The demographic crisis that had been developing for centuries became acute during the period of imperial dominance. The small citizen population that had been adequate for defending the Peloponnese was completely insufficient for governing and garrisoning territories throughout the Mediterranean. Sparta was forced to rely increasingly on allies, mercenaries, and helots for military functions that had traditionally been performed by citizens. This reliance on non-citizen military forces created a vicious cycle that accelerated Spartan decline. As citizens became administrators, rather than warriors, their military skills deteriorated. As military functions were delegated to others, the justification for the harsh social system that produced citizen warriors became less compelling. As the citizen population declined through war casualties and low birth rates, the remaining citizens became increasingly unable to maintain control over their subject populations. The helot system, which had been the economic foundation of Spartan power, began to show signs of strain under the pressures of imperial administration. Managing territories throughout the Greek world required resources and attention that had previously been devoted to helot supervision. The rigid control mechanisms that had prevented successful rebellions for centuries became harder to maintain when Spartan attention was divided among dozens of different military and political challenges. The Persian funding that had made Spartan victory possible also created long-term problems that undermined traditional Spartan independence. The gold that had built Spartan naval power came with Persian political influence and strategic priorities that didn't always align with Spartan interests. Sparta found itself increasingly dependent on Persian support for maintaining its imperial position, compromising the autonomy that had been a fundamental principle of their political system. The most serious challenge to Spartan hegemony came from an unexpected source. Thebes, a Greek city that had been a minor player in previous conflicts, but now emerged as a formidable military and political power. The Thebans had learned from both Athenian and Spartan examples, developing innovative military tactics and political institutions that were better adapted to the realities of 4th century Greek warfare. The rise of Thebes wasn't just about military innovation, it was about a fundamental shift in the nature of Greek political and military competition. The old model of city-state independence was giving way to a new reality of regional federations and professional armies that could challenge traditional powers through superior organization and tactics, rather than individual warrior excellence. Epaminondas, the Theban general who would destroy Spartan military supremacy, represented everything that the Spartan system was least equipped to handle. He was an intellectual as well as a warrior, a political theorist who understood the relationship between military tactics and social organization. He had studied Spartan strengths and weaknesses systematically, developing specific countermeasures for the military techniques that had made Sparta dominant for 3 centuries. The Theban military innovations that Epaminondas developed were elegantly simple but devastating in their effectiveness against traditional Spartan tactics. The oblique order concentrated superior force against a single point in the enemy battle line, using depth and weight rather than individual skill to achieve breakthrough. The sacred band, an elite unit of paired lovers, provided the kind of unit cohesion that had previously been a Spartan monopoly. But the most important Theban innovation was strategic rather than tactical. Epaminondas understood that Spartan military power depended on the helot system, and he developed a comprehensive strategy for attacking this foundation rather than simply defeating Spartan armies in battle. This represented a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military capability and social organization than any previous enemy had demonstrated. The conflict that led to the decisive battle at Leuctra in 371 BCE began with relatively minor disputes between Sparta and Thebes over influence in central Greece. But these surface disagreements reflected deeper tensions about the future direction of Greek political development. Sparta represented the old model of military aristocracy ruling through traditional institutions, while Thebes represented newer approaches to political organization and military technology. The battle itself revealed how completely the military balance had shifted against Sparta. The tactical innovations that Epaminondas had developed proved devastatingly effective against traditional Spartan phalanx formations. The oblique order concentrated Theban strength against the Spartan right wing, where King Leonidas commanded the elite troops that should have been the strongest part of the Spartan line. The death of Leonidas in the initial Theban assault created a crisis of command that the Spartan system was poorly equipped to handle. The rigid military hierarchy that worked well in victory became a source of confusion and paralysis when faced with unexpected tactical situations. Units that had been trained to follow orders without question found themselves without clear leadership when their commanders were killed or wounded. More importantly, the Spartan warriors themselves proved vulnerable to the new Theban tactics in ways that revealed fundamental limitations in their training and equipment. The individual excellence that had been the foundation of Spartan military superiority for centuries was irrelevant when faced with massed attacks that relied on weight and momentum rather than personal skill. The psychological impact of defeat at Leuctra was even more devastating than the immediate military consequences. For 3 centuries, Spartan military invincibility had been the central organizing principle of their society and the foundation of their political system. The discovery that Spartan warriors could be defeated in fair combat by other Greeks shattered the ideological basis of their entire social order. The immediate aftermath of Leuctra saw unprecedented developments that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. For the first time in centuries, enemy armies invaded Laconia itself, the Spartan homeland that had been considered inviolable since the original Dorian conquest. The psychological impact of foreign troops marching through territory that had never been successfully invaded was catastrophic for Spartan morale and prestige. But the most significant consequence of Theban victory was the liberation of Messenia, the conquest of which had provided the economic foundation for classical Spartan society. Epaminondas understood that simply defeating Spartan armies wouldn't permanently reduce Spartan power. He had to attack the helot system that made Spartan military culture possible. The liberation of the Messenian helots eliminated, at a stroke, the agricultural surplus that had supported the Spartan citizen class for over 3 centuries. Without helot labor to work their estates, Spartan citizens were forced to choose between maintaining their military lifestyle and supporting themselves economically. Most chose economic survival, abandoning the military training and social discipline that had made them effective warriors. The establishment of Megalopolis as a fortified city, controlling access to Laconia, represented a permanent strategic threat that Sparta lacked the resources to eliminate. For the first time since the Dark Ages, Sparta faced the possibility of successful invasion by land-based enemies who could threaten the Helot system directly. The entire defensive strategy that had protected Spartan society for centuries was no longer viable. The demographic consequences of defeat at Leuctra accelerated the population decline that had been weakening Sparta for generations. Hundreds of citizen warriors were killed in the battle itself, representing an irreplaceable loss to a society that could no longer afford significant casualties. The survivors faced economic pressures that made marriage and child-rearing increasingly difficult, further reducing the birth rate among the citizen class. Perhaps most importantly, the ideological foundations of Spartan society were irreparably damaged by the demonstration that their military system was no longer superior to those of their enemies. The harsh social discipline that had been justified by military necessity now seemed pointless. When that discipline no longer produced military advantage, the sacrifices that had been acceptable when they guaranteed victory became intolerable when they led to defeat. The attempts to rebuild Spartan power after Leuctra revealed how thoroughly their society had been transformed by the pressures of imperial administration and military defeat. The citizens who remained were no longer the austere warriors of classical times. They were men who had been corrupted by exposure to wealth and luxury, who had lost the social discipline that had made their ancestors effective, and who lacked the numbers necessary to maintain traditional military practices. The traditional institutions of Spartan government proved completely inadequate for managing the crisis that followed defeat. The dual kingship, council of elders, and citizen assembly had been designed for making decisions about relatively simple military matters, not for handling the complex political and economic challenges that came with military decline and territorial loss. More fundamentally, the social system that had produced Spartan military excellence was no longer economically viable without the Helot labor force that had been its foundation. The attempt to maintain traditional Spartan lifestyle without Helot agricultural surplus forced citizens to choose between military training and economic survival. Most chose survival, abandoning the military culture that had defined their identity for centuries. The twilight of Sparta wasn't a gradual decline spread over generations. It was a catastrophic collapse that occurred within a single decade. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE marked the end of Spartan military dominance. The liberation of Messenia eliminated the economic foundation of their society, and the invasion of Laconia shattered the psychological basis of their political system. By 360 BCE, less than 50 years after their victory over Athens, Sparta had been reduced from the dominant power in Greece to a regional city-state struggling to maintain its independence. The society that had once terrified enemies throughout the Mediterranean was now unable to defend its own territory against traditional rivals. The military culture that had been the envy and fear of the ancient world had collapsed so completely that it could never be rebuilt. The twilight of Sparta was complete, but the legend was just beginning. As the reality of Spartan power faded into history, the myth of Spartan excellence began to grow in the imagination of later generations, who would remember the victories and forget the limitations that had made those victories temporary. The collapse of Spartan military dominance after Leuctra should have marked the end of their historical significance, but instead it began a new chapter, in which Sparta struggled to find relevance in a rapidly changing world that had moved far beyond the city-state model that had once made them powerful. The rise of Macedon, under Philip II and his son Alexander, created political and military realities that made traditional Spartan approaches to warfare and governance completely obsolete. Philip II of Macedon represented everything that Sparta was not: innovative, adaptive, willing to learn from others, and capable of integrating different military traditions into a coherent system that was superior to any of its components. While Sparta clung to traditional phalanx tactics and social institutions that had been effective 3 centuries earlier, Philip developed new approaches to warfare that combined Macedonian heavy cavalry, improved infantry equipment, and siege technologies that could overcome any traditional Greek defensive system. The Macedonian military revolution wasn't just about better weapons or tactics, it was about a fundamentally different approach to organizing and employing military power. Philip created the first truly professional army in European history, with soldiers who served for years rather than seasons, who were equipped with standardized weapons and armor, and who were trained to fight as part of integrated combined arms formations. This professional military system required resources and organizational capabilities that were far beyond what any traditional city-state could provide. Philip controlled gold mines in Thrace that provided the financial foundation for maintaining large standing armies. He developed administrative systems that could manage complex logistics over vast distances. Most importantly, he created political institutions that could integrate conquered territories into a unified kingdom, rather than simply extracting tribute. Sparta watched these developments with a mixture of incomprehension and disdain. The traditional Spartan worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility that their military system might be fundamentally obsolete. The social conditioning that had made Spartan warriors effective also made them psychologically incapable of acknowledging that others might have developed superior approaches to warfare. The first direct confrontation between Spartan and Macedonian military systems came in 338 BCE at the Battle of Chaeronea, where Philip defeated a coalition of Greek city-states that included both Athens and Thebes. Sparta wasn't present at this decisive battle. They had refused to join the coalition against Philip, not from cowardice but from a stubborn insistence that they could maintain their independence through their own military strength. This absence from Chaeronea was typical of Sparta's response to the Macedonian challenge. Rather than adapting to new realities or forming alliances that might preserve some degree of autonomy, Sparta chose isolation and defiance. They seemed to believe that their reputation for military excellence would somehow protect them from the new forms of power that Philip was developing. The aftermath of Chaeronea demonstrated how completely the balance of power in Greece had shifted. Philip established the League of Corinth, a political organization that united most Greek city-states under Macedonian leadership for a planned invasion of Persia. Every significant Greek power joined this league except Sparta, which maintained its traditional isolationism even when that isolation guaranteed political irrelevance. Philip's approach to dealing with Sparta revealed both the extent of Macedonian power and the degree to which Sparta had become politically insignificant. Rather than conquering Sparta directly, Philip simply ignored them. He invaded Laconia, devastated Spartan territory, and liberated additional Helot communities, but he didn't bother to occupy Spartan territory or destroy their city. Sparta had become so weak that it wasn't worth the effort required for complete conquest. This calculated humiliation was more devastating to Spartan pride than outright destruction would have been. Philip was demonstrating that Sparta was no longer significant enough to require serious attention. The city that had once dominated Greek politics was now treated as a minor irritant that could be dealt with through occasional raids rather than systematic conquest. The rise of Alexander the Great accelerated the trends that were making traditional city-state politics obsolete. Alexander's conquests created an empire that stretched from Egypt to India, fundamentally changing the scale and nature of political organization in the ancient world. The parochial concerns that had motivated Greek city-state conflicts for centuries became irrelevant in a world where single rulers controlled territories larger than entire continents. Sparta's response to Alexander's invitation to join his Persian expedition was entirely predictable. They refused, maintaining their traditional policy of avoiding foreign entanglements. But this refusal was no longer based on strength, it was based on weakness. Sparta couldn't contribute meaningfully to Alexander's campaigns because they lacked the military resources, the organizational capabilities, and the cultural adaptability that such participation would have required. While Alexander was conquering the Persian Empire and spreading Greek culture throughout Asia, Sparta was engaged in a minor revolt led by King Aegeis III that demonstrated how completely their military capabilities had deteriorated. This rebellion, which occurred while Alexander was campaigning in India, was suppressed by Macedonian forces without requiring Alexander's personal attention. The king who had conquered Persia didn't even bother to return to deal with Spartan resistance. The defeat and death of Aegeis III in 331 BCE marked the final end of Spartan military significance. The rebellion had been a desperate attempt to regain relevance by challenging Macedonian power when most of their forces were absent on campaign. Its failure demonstrated that Sparta lacked even the capability to take advantage of favorable circumstances, let alone to compete with the new forms of power that were reshaping the Mediterranean world. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander's death saw the emergence of large territorial kingdoms ruled by his successors, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedonia. These kingdoms operated on scales that made traditional city-state politics completely irrelevant. Sparta found itself reduced to the status of a minor client state, whose main value was symbolic rather than strategic. The attempt to maintain traditional Spartan institutions in this new environment produced increasingly bizarre results. The kings, ephors, and citizen assembly continued to function, but they were governing a society that bore no resemblance to classical Sparta. The citizen population had declined to a few hundred families. The helot system had been largely dismantled, and the economic foundation of Spartan society had disappeared. The social revolution led by King Cleomenes III in the late 3rd century BCE represented a desperate attempt to restore Spartan power by abandoning the traditional institutions that had made them distinctive. Cleomenes abolished the ephorate, redistributed land to create new citizens, and attempted to recreate the military culture that had made Sparta famous. But these reforms came too late, and were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what had made classical Sparta effective. The reformed Spartan army that Cleomenes created was a pale imitation of its classical predecessor. The new citizens lacked the generational conditioning that had made traditional Spartan warriors effective. The military training was abbreviated and superficial compared to the lifelong socialization that had characterized the classical Agoge. Most importantly, the demographic and economic conditions that had supported the original system no longer existed. The brief military successes that Cleomenes achieved against other Peloponnesian cities created the illusion that Sparta might be able to regain its former position. But these victories were won against enemies who were equally weak and obsolete, not against the professional armies and sophisticated political organizations that now dominated the Mediterranean world. The intervention of Macedonia, under Antigonus Doson, quickly ended Cleomenes' experiment in Spartan restoration. The Battle of Seleucia in 222 BCE saw the last Spartan army destroyed by Macedonian forces, using the same combined arms tactics that Philip II had developed decades earlier. Cleomenes fled to Egypt, where he died in exile, and Sparta was occupied by Macedonian troops for the first time in its history. The Roman conquest of Greece in the 2nd century BCE reduced Sparta to the status of a provincial museum, preserved not for its contemporary relevance, but for its historical associations. Roman tourists visited Sparta to see the remnants of the famous military culture, much as modern tourists visit historical sites to connect with a romanticized past. The Romans found Sparta fascinating precisely because it was so different from their own approach to power and organization. Roman military success was based on adaptability, organizational innovation, and the systematic integration of conquered peoples. Spartan military culture had been based on exclusivity, cultural conservatism, and the rigid maintenance of traditional practices. Roman writers like Plutarch created the literary version of Sparta that would influence Western imagination for the next 2,000 years. This romanticized Sparta emphasized the heroic aspects of their military culture, while ignoring the social costs and strategic limitations that had led to their decline. The myth of Spartan excellence grew stronger as the reality of Spartan power faded into history. The transformation of Sparta into a tourist destination revealed how completely their society had been transformed by historical change. The city that had once forbidden foreign visitors now depended on them economically. The warrior culture that had prized secrecy and isolation now performed traditional rituals for the entertainment of curious outsiders. Young Spartans continued to endure ritual floggings at the altar of Artemis Orthia, but these ceremonies were now entertainment for Roman spectators rather than genuine military training. The traditional institutions continued to function, but they governed a society that was completely dependent on outside support and had no real political autonomy. The persistence of Spartan institutions long after they had lost their original function demonstrated both the power of cultural tradition and its ultimate irrelevance when faced with fundamental changes in political and military technology. Sparta had become a living museum, preserving the forms of classical military culture while completely losing its substance. The final irony of Spartan history was that their greatest influence came not from their military achievements, but from their literary reputation. The Sparta that inspired later generations was largely a creation of non-Spartan writers who emphasized the heroic aspects of their culture while ignoring its limitations and contradictions. This mythological Sparta would prove more durable and influential than the historical reality had ever been. While the actual Spartan military system had lasted only a few centuries before being superseded by more effective approaches to warfare, the idea of Spartan excellence would inspire military cultures for the next 2 millennia. The end of historical Sparta was not dramatic. It was a quiet fade into provincial irrelevance as the world moved beyond the city-state model that had made them briefly dominant. But the beginning of mythological Sparta was just starting, as later generations would find in their story lessons and inspiration that the historical Spartans themselves might not have recognized. The historical Sparta died a quiet death in the provincial obscurity of Roman Greece, but the mythological Sparta was just being born. Over the next 2,000 years, the idea of Spartan excellence would prove far more powerful and enduring than the reality had ever been, inspiring military cultures, educational theories, and political movements that would have been unrecognizable to the warriors who died at Thermopylae. The transformation of Sparta from historical reality to cultural myth began almost immediately after their military decline. Greek and Roman writers, fascinated by a society so different from their own, began creating literary versions of Spartan culture that emphasized heroic virtues while ignoring practical limitations. These early accounts established the basic narrative framework that would shape Western understanding of Sparta for centuries to come. Plutarch's biography of Lycurgus, written in the 1st century CE, became the most influential ancient source on Spartan society. Plutarch wasn't a historian in the modern sense. He was a moralist who used historical examples to illustrate philosophical points about virtue and character. His account of Spartan institutions was designed to provide moral instruction rather than accurate historical description. Plutarch's Sparta was a society of perfect warriors who had achieved moral excellence through rigorous self-discipline and devotion to collective good. This idealized version ignored the helot system that had made Spartan military culture possible, downplayed the brutal aspects of Spartan education, and presented their isolationism as virtuous self-sufficiency rather than strategic limitation. The mythological power of this idealized Sparta was enormous. Here was a society that had apparently solved the fundamental problems of human organization by subordinating individual desires to collective necessity. The warriors Plutarch described weren't motivated by greed, ambition, or personal glory. They fought and died purely from devotion to their community and its values. This moral interpretation of Spartan history appealed particularly to societies that were struggling with problems of luxury, corruption, and social decay. Throughout history, cultures that felt they had become soft and decadent would look back to Sparta as an example of the virtue and discipline that they believed they had lost. The Renaissance revival of classical learning brought new attention to Spartan examples, but filtered through humanist educational theories that emphasized moral development rather than military training. Renaissance educators saw in Spartan methods a model for character formation that could be adapted to produce virtuous citizens rather than professional warriors. This educational interpretation of Spartan culture would prove remarkably persistent. For centuries, European schools would use watered-down versions of Spartan training methods to build character in their students. Cold baths, physical exercise, simple food, and strict discipline were all justified by reference to Spartan examples, even when the original context and purpose had been completely abandoned. The Enlightenment brought new interpretations of Spartan political institutions that emphasized their apparently democratic elements while ignoring their exclusivity and dependence on slave labor. Philosophers like Rousseau saw in Sparta an example of how education and social institutions could shape human nature, creating citizens who naturally preferred public good to private advantage. The American revolutionaries found in Sparta examples of republican virtue that they hoped to recreate in their new nation. George Washington was frequently compared to classical Spartan kings, and the Cincinnati Society of Revolutionary War Officers explicitly modeled itself on Spartan examples of citizen soldiers returning to civilian life after military service. But the most significant modern appropriation of Spartan symbolism came with the rise of nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Societies that defined themselves through military struggle found in Sparta a model of total commitment to collective defense that could justify extreme measures and total social mobilization. The German interpretation of Spartan culture during the Nazi period represents the darkest example of how mythological Sparta could be used to justify oppression and violence. Nazi ideologists saw in Sparta a model for their own racial state, emphasizing Spartan exclusivity, militarism, and willingness to eliminate weakness. This interpretation conveniently ignored the reality that historical Sparta had been remarkably unsuccessful in most of its military endeavors. The Cold War period saw new appropriations of Spartan symbolism by both sides in the ideological conflict. Western militaries emphasized Spartan individual heroism and resistance to tyranny, while communist states pointed to Spartan collective discipline and subordination of individual interests to social needs. Both interpretations were selectively chosen to support contemporary political agendas rather than to understand historical reality. Modern popular culture has created perhaps the most distorted version of Spartan history, emphasizing individual heroism and martial spectacle while completely ignoring the social and economic foundations that made Spartan military culture possible. Movies, video games, and novels present Sparta as a society of superhuman warriors whose military excellence was somehow divorced from the brutal realities of ancient slavery and social oppression. This popular cultural version of Sparta appeals to contemporary audiences precisely because it offers a fantasy of military excellence without moral complexity. Modern Sparta is a place where warriors fight purely for honor and freedom, without the uncomfortable realities of helot oppression, child abandonment, and systematic violence that characterized the historical society. The persistence of Spartan mythology reveals something important about human psychology and social organization. Every society struggles with the tension between individual desires and collective needs, and most find it difficult to maintain the discipline and sacrifice necessary for long-term survival. Sparta represents a solution to these problems, even if that solution was ultimately unsustainable and morally problematic. The educational legacy of Sparta is perhaps more significant than its military influence. For over 2,000 years, educators have looked to Spartan methods as examples of how rigorous training can shape human character and capability. While few modern educators would endorse the brutality of the original Agoge, many still believe that character is formed through challenge, discipline, and the gradual increase of demands and expectations. Modern military training programs around the world still use methods that can be traced back to Spartan examples. The emphasis on unit cohesion, the use of shared hardship to build bonds between soldiers, the deliberate creation of artificial stress to test psychological resilience, all of these approaches reflect insights that the Spartans pioneered thousands of years ago. But the most important lesson of Spartan history may be negative rather than positive. Sparta demonstrates the dangers of social systems that prioritize a single goal above all others. Their exclusive focus on military excellence produced remarkable short-term results, but it also created a society that was brittle, inflexible, and ultimately unable to adapt to changing circumstances. The demographic limitations that eventually destroyed Sparta offer particular lessons for modern societies. The Spartan citizen population never exceeded a few thousand adults, making them vulnerable to casualties that larger societies could easily absorb. Their exclusive social system prevented them from integrating new populations or adapting to population decline, creating a death spiral that eventually made them militarily irrelevant. The economic foundation of Spartan society, the exploitation of helot labor, created military capabilities that were ultimately unsustainable. The constant threat of helot rebellion absorbed resources and attention that might have been used for expansion or adaptation. The moral corruption that came from systematic oppression undermined the very values that Spartan military culture was supposed to embody. Perhaps most importantly, Spartan isolationism prevented them from learning from others or adapting to new forms of military and political organization. The cultural conservatism that preserved their distinctive institutions also made it impossible for them to respond effectively when those institutions became obsolete. The lesson isn't that military excellence is unimportant, or that discipline and sacrifice are meaningless. The lesson is that these qualities must be balanced against other human values and must be adaptable to changing circumstances. Societies that define themselves too narrowly or pursue single goals too exclusively risk the same kind of decline that eventually overtook Sparta. Modern democracies face some of the same challenges that confronted ancient Sparta, though in very different forms. How do you maintain social cohesion in diverse societies? How do you balance individual freedom with collective needs? How do you preserve cultural values while adapting to technological and social change? How do you maintain military effectiveness without becoming militaristic? The Spartan example suggests that there are no easy answers to these questions, but it also demonstrates the importance of asking them. Societies that stop questioning their fundamental assumptions, or that become too rigid in their approaches to social organization, risk the same kind of decline that reduced the most famous military culture in history to a tourist curiosity. The final irony of Spartan history is that their greatest achievement may have been creating a story that continues to inspire and instruct, long after the society that created it has vanished. The historical Spartans lasted only a few centuries before being superseded by more effective forms of military and political organization, but the mythological Spartans have influenced human culture for over 2 millennia and show no signs of losing their power. This suggests that the most important legacy of any society may not be its immediate practical achievements, but the stories it leaves behind and the lessons those stories teach to future generations. Sparta's story teaches us about the possibilities and limitations of human social organization, about the costs and benefits of discipline and sacrifice, and about the eternal tension between individual desires and collective needs. The warriors who died at Thermopylae could never have imagined that their sacrifice would be remembered and celebrated thousands of years later by people living in societies they couldn't have conceived. But their story has become part of the permanent heritage of human civilization, a reminder of what people can achieve when they commit themselves completely to ideals larger than their individual lives. The legacy of the Spartans is thus both inspiring and cautionary. It reminds us of the heights that human beings can reach through discipline, training, and collective commitment. But it also warns us of the dangers of extremism, exclusivity, and the subordination of all human values to a single goal. The true lesson of Sparta may be that excellence is always possible, but it must be pursued with wisdom, moderation, and respect for the full range of human needs and aspirations. In the end, Sparta faded quietly into history, but its legend lives on, a permanent reminder of both human potential and human limitations. A story that continues to inspire and instruct as each new generation faces the eternal challenges of social organization